You face opponents who won't back down, turning every confrontation into an exhausting war of attrition. Every direct battle wastes your resources while they dig in deeper. And you're realizing that brute force is destroying you faster than your enemies. I am Sun Tzu, the strategist who discovered that supreme excellence is subduing enemies without fighting, by breaking their will before battle begins. What I learned about psychological warfare will transform how you handle every conflict and competitive situation in your life. The same principles that caused armies to surrender without a sword being drawn can help you win through mental dominance rather than destruction. But first, like this video, subscribe for more warfare wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. Let's see which corner of the world is ready for victory without violence. Let me tell you how I discovered the most powerful weapon in warfare, not the sword, not the spear, but the human mind itself. In my early years as a military commander, I was like every other general, believing that victory came through superior numbers, better weapons, and more aggressive tactics. I was wrong, and my mistakes nearly cost me everything. I remember my first major campaign as a young officer. We faced an enemy force that had fortified themselves in the mountains, and my initial instinct was to attack directly. I believed that courage and determination would overcome their defensive advantage. For 3 months, I sent wave after wave of soldiers against their positions. Each assault failed, and I watched good men die for mere yards of worthless ground. The artifact I carry from that time is a broken sword, not broken in glorious battle, but snapped in half when I threw it down in frustration after another failed assault. That broken blade became my teacher, showing me that brute force was not just ineffective, it was foolish. The enemy hadn't defeated my army through superior fighting. They had defeated my mind through superior positioning and patience. During those sleepless nights in my tent, staring at that broken sword, I began to study something no other general was studying: the psychology of warfare. I watched how my own soldiers' morale fluctuated, not based on their weapons or training, but based on their belief in victory. I observed how enemy prisoners reacted differently to interrogation depending on their mental state, not their physical condition. The breakthrough came when I realized that every battle was really two wars happening simultaneously. There was the physical war of swords and shields that everyone could see, and there was the invisible war of minds and wills that determined the outcome of the visible one. The army that lost the mental war would lose the physical war, regardless of their apparent advantages. I began experimenting with this understanding. Instead of sending my soldiers to attack the enemy's strongest positions, I sent small groups to harass their supply lines and disrupt their sleep. Instead of challenging their commanders to honorable combat, I spread rumors about dissension in their ranks. Instead of trying to break their walls, I worked to break their confidence. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, the same enemy force that had resisted my direct assaults for 3 months began making mistakes. Their sentries became jumpy and unreliable. Their officers started arguing among themselves. Their soldiers began deserting in small groups during the night. When I finally did attack, it wasn't really a battle, it was a formality. The enemy's will to fight had already been broken through psychological pressure. They surrendered after token resistance, and I achieved complete victory with minimal casualties on either side. That campaign taught me that the supreme excellence in warfare is not to win 100 victories in 100 battles, but to subdue the enemy without fighting at all. The greatest victory is the one where your enemy defeats himself through the collapse of his own will to resist. The greatest victory I ever achieved required not a single drop of blood to be spilled. It was a lesson that transformed my understanding of what true power means, and it came through an artifact I treasure to this day: a surrendered banner, given to me willingly by an enemy commander who had never been defeated in battle. The situation seemed impossible. I faced an enemy army twice the size of mine, led by a general with an unbroken record of victories. His forces controlled the high ground, had superior supplies, and the morale that comes from never having tasted defeat. Every advisor urged me to retreat and regroup, but I saw an opportunity that existed not on the battlefield, but in the realm of the mind. I spent weeks studying this enemy commander, not his tactics or his troop movements, but his psychology. Through captured prisoners and careful observation, I learned that his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He had never lost because he had never been truly challenged mentally. His victories had always come through overwhelming force and traditional tactics. He was like a master swordsman who had never faced an opponent who had fought with different rules. Instead of challenging him to the kind of battle he expected and excelled at, I began a campaign of pure psychological warfare. I sent small forces to appear briefly on distant hills, creating the illusion that I commanded a much larger army approaching from multiple directions. I had my men light countless fires at night to suggest massive encampments that didn't exist. I planted false information with merchants and travelers about reinforcements arriving from the capital, but the masterstroke was understanding what this commander valued most: his reputation for invincibility. Through carefully orchestrated intelligence, I made sure he learned that the capital was watching this battle closely, and that the emperor had specifically chosen me because I was known for achieving impossible victories through mysterious means. Cultivated an aura of supernatural strategic ability. My spies spread stories about how I had won previous battles through prophetic dreams and mystical insights. I timed my army's movements to coincide with unusual weather patterns, making it appear that even the heavens were cooperating with my plans. The psychological pressure built systematically over 3 weeks. I watched through my scouts as this previously confident commander became increasingly agitated and indecisive. He began making defensive preparations for attacks that never came from directions I never intended to use. He started questioning his own officers and changing plans. Multiple times per day, the decisive moment came when I sent him a message under a flag of truce. I didn't threaten him or boast about my strength. Instead, I simply stated that I admired his reputation and offered him the honor of a single combat between champions, with the losing army agreeing to withdraw from the region. But I made this offer with a subtle twist. I suggested that as the more experienced commander, he should have the privilege of choosing whether to accept this ancient and honorable tradition. This put him in an impossible psychological position. If he refused, he would appear afraid of personal combat, destroying his image of invincibility. If he accepted, he would be fighting on my terms, not his. But the real trap was deeper. By framing the offer as his choice and his privilege, I made him feel that accepting was a sign of strength, when actually it was an admission that traditional battle wasn't working for him. He accepted, but not with confidence. His champion fought my champion, and though it was an honest contest, my man won through superior preparation and technique. According to the agreed terms, his army was bound to withdraw, but something greater happened. His personal aura of invincibility was shattered in front of his entire force. As his army prepared to leave, the commander himself approached my tent. He handed me his personal battle standard, the surrendered banner I mentioned. Dan said something I will never forget. You have taught me that there are forms of strength I never understood. I yield not just this battle, but the knowledge that you are the superior strategist. That banner represents the highest form of victory, not the defeat of an enemy, but the willing acknowledgement of your superiority. No soldiers died that day, yet I achieved more complete control than any massacre could have provided. I gained not just the territory, but the respect and future cooperation of a formidable military mind. This is what I mean by supreme excellence. You subdue the enemy without fighting. Violence is easy. Any fool with a sword can kill. But to win through the power of mind over mind, will over will, Strategy over strength. This is the art that separates true masters from mere warriors. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the sharpest sword, but the one whose mind you cannot read. Early in my career, I learned this lesson through painful experience, and it led me to develop what I call the mirror of intentions, systematic method for understanding the deepest motivations that drive your opponents to fight. I was facing a rebel commander who had been successfully evading capture for over a year. Every time Imperial forces cornered him, he somehow escaped through tactics that seemed to anticipate our every move. Other generals assumed he had superior scouts or inside information, but I suspected something deeper. He was reading our minds, better than we were reading his dot. I began studying this enemy, not as a military problem, but as a psychological puzzle. I collected every piece of information about his background, his family, his rise to rebellion, and most importantly, his pattern of decisions under pressure. What I discovered changed how I approach every opponent to this day. This commander wasn't just fighting for political reasons or personal gain. He was fighting to prove something to a father who had died believing his son was a failure. Every tactical choice he made was influenced by this deeper psychological need to demonstrate worth through impossible victories. Once I understood this core motivation, his seemingly random tactics became predictable. The human mind operates on 3 distinct levels, and you must understand all 3 to break an enemy's will effectively. The surface level contains the obvious desires territory, wealth, power, revenge. These are what most people focus on, and they're usually wrong about what really drives their opponent. The second level holds the hidden fears that people don't admit even to themselves. Fear of humiliation, fear of irrelevance, fear of proving their critics right. These hidden fears often drive behavior more powerfully than conscious desires. My rebel commander's hidden fear was that his father had been right about his worthlessness. The deepest level contains the core identity, who this person believes they are at their fundamental essence. A person will sacrifice everything else to protect this core sense of self. They'll give up wealth, power, even life itself, rather than admit that their fundamental self-image is false. Once you map these 3 levels for any opponent, you possess a complete psychological profile that allows you to predict their reactions and identify their breaking points. More importantly, you can craft psychological pressure that targets their actual vulnerabilities, rather than wasting effort on irrelevant attacks. With my rebel commander, I stopped trying to capture him through military tactics and instead attacked his psychological foundation. I arranged for documents to be discovered that showed his father had actually spoken proudly of him before his death, but had been prevented from expressing this by political circumstances. I made sure these documents reached him through seemingly accidental channels. The effect was immediate and devastating. His entire rebellion had been fueled by the need to prove himself worthy of a father's love that he had actually possessed all along. Within days of learning this truth, he lost the psychological drive that had made him so formidable. He made increasingly desperate and reckless decisions, trying to recapture the sense of purpose that had sustained him. The campaign ended when he surrendered voluntarily, saying that he no longer remembered why he had been fighting. I had broken his will not by defeating his army, but by removing the psychological foundation that gave his resistance meaning. This experience taught me that knowledge of your enemy's mind is more valuable than knowledge of his military capabilities. A force fighting for survival will perform beyond their apparent limits, while a superior army fighting without clear purpose will crumble at the first real pressure. In modern terms, whether you're negotiating a business deal, managing workplace conflict, or competing for opportunities, the same principle applies. The person who understands the deeper psychological motivations will almost always defeat the person who focuses only on surface-level tactics. Before engaging any opponent, ask yourself, What do they really want at the deepest level? What are they trying to prove to themselves or others? What would they sacrifice everything else to protect? What truth about themselves are they most afraid to confront? When you can answer these questions accurately, you possess the mirror of intentions, the ability to see into your opponent's mind more clearly than they can see into yours. This knowledge becomes your greatest strategic advantage, allowing you to predict their moves, exploit their weaknesses, and ultimately break their will to oppose you. While learning to break the minds of my enemies, I discovered something equally crucially needed to fortify my own mind against their attempts to break me. Through years of psychological warfare, I developed what I call the unbreakable mind, a mental fortress built on 5 essential pillars that no enemy has ever penetrated. The first pillar is clarity of purpose. You cannot maintain psychological strength if you're unclear about why you're fighting. I learned this during a campaign where enemy agents spread false information about my orders from the capital. For 3 days, I doubted whether my mission was legitimate, and that doubt nearly paralyzed my decision-making ability. Your purpose must be so clear and deeply understood that no external voice can shake your conviction. When someone tries to confuse you about your goals or make you question your direction, absolute clarity becomes your shield. I developed the practice of writing down my core purpose before every campaign and reviewing it daily, especially when facing psychological pressure. The second pillar is emotional detachment. This doesn't mean becoming cold or unfeeling. It means refusing to let your emotions become weapons that others can use against you. I once faced an enemy who discovered that I had a deep affection for one of my young officers, a brave soldier, who reminded me of my younger brother. This enemy captured the officer and sent me daily reports of his torture, designed to make me act rashly to save him. The emotional pressure was enormous, but I had trained myself to separate tactical decisions from emotional responses. I mounted a rescue mission based on strategic calculation, not emotional desperation, and saved both the officer and my army from walking into a trap. Emotional detachment means feeling your emotions fully, but never letting them control your actions. Your enemies will study what you care about and use it against you. They'll threaten what you love, insult what you value, and try to make you angry enough to make mistakes. When you maintain emotional detachment, these attacks lose their power. The third pillar is strategic patience. Most people lose psychological battles because they need immediate results and immediate satisfaction. They cannot endure uncertainty or delay gratification long enough to execute superior strategies. This impatience becomes their downfall. I cultivated the ability to wait years for the right moment to strike, to endure months of apparent disadvantage while my deeper plans developed. During one siege, I waited 8 months while the enemy mocked my inaction, and my own officers questioned my strategy. But I was patient because I knew that time was working in my favor. Their supplies were diminishing while mine remained secure. Strategic patience means understanding that the best outcomes often require the longest preparation when others are rushing to quick solutions. Your patience becomes a devastating advantage. The fourth pillar is adaptive thinking. Rigid minds break under pressure. Flexible minds bend and recover stronger. I trained myself to hold multiple possible strategies simultaneously, ready to shift approaches instantly based on changing circumstances. During one battle, my original plan was completely undermined by unexpected enemy movements. Instead of panicking or forcing a failed strategy, I immediately activated an entirely different approach I had prepared as a contingency. This mental flexibility not only saved the campaign, but turned a potential defeat into a decisive victory. Adaptive thinking means never becoming so attached to one plan that you cannot abandon it when circumstances change. Your enemies will try to force you into rigid thinking by making you overcommit to specific approaches. The fifth pillar is absolute confidence in ultimate victory. This is not blind optimism or wishful thinking. is the deep conviction that, regardless of temporary setbacks, your superior strategy and mental discipline will eventually triumph. This confidence must be built on real competence and preparation, not false bravado. When you truly know that you've prepared better, thought deeper, and understood more clearly than your opponent, you develop an unshakable calm that no psychological attack can disturb. I faced situations where everything seemed lost: armies scattered, allies betrayed, supplies cut off. But because I maintained absolute confidence in my ultimate victory, I continued making strategic decisions when others would have panicked or surrendered. This confidence often became self-fulfilling, as my calm certainty in desperate situations inspired others to continue fighting when they wanted to give up. These 5 pillars work together to create psychological invulnerability. When your purpose is clear, your emotions controlled, your patience developed, your thinking flexible, and your confidence absolute, you become immune to the mental warfare tactics that destroy weaker minds. Building this mental fortress takes years of conscious practice, but once constructed, it makes you nearly impossible to defeat through psychological means. Your enemies may still challenge you tactically, but they cannot break your will or cloud your judgment. Most importantly, this inner strength allows you to use psychological warfare ethically and effectively. When your own mind is secure, you can apply mental pressure to opponents without being corrupted by the process or losing yourself in the pursuit of victory. The most foolish generals attack where the enemy is strongest. The wisest generals attack where the enemy is weakest. But the supreme generals attack where the enemy doesn't even know they can be attacked. Their strategy itself. I learned this through an artifact I call the redirected arrow, a weapon that taught me how to turn an enemy's own power against them. I was facing a brilliant tactician who had never lost a battle. His army was smaller than mine, but his strategic mind was so sharp that he consistently outmaneuvered larger forces. Every direct approach I considered, he had already anticipated and prepared countermeasures for. His strength wasn't in his soldiers or weapons, it was in his ability to think 3 moves ahead of any opponent. Traditional military wisdom said I should attack his weakest flank or try to divide his forces, but I realized that as long as his strategic mind remained intact, he would adapt to any conventional assault. Instead, I needed to attack his strategy-making process itself. I began by studying not what he planned, but how he planned. I discovered that his strategic brilliance came from a very specific methodology. He would gather intelligence, identify his opponent's most likely moves, prepare counters for each possibility, then choose the battlefield and timing that gave him maximum advantage. His process was flawless, which made it predictable. Instead of trying to outthink him within his strategic framework, I decided to feed false information into his intelligence-gathering system. But this had to be done carefully. If the false information was too obvious, he would detect the deception and adapt. The lies had to be believable enough to shape his strategic calculations while leading him toward decisions that would ultimately destroy him. I arranged for captured prisoners to carry specific pieces of misinformation when they escaped or were exchanged. I had spies spread rumors that contained enough truth to be credible, but were fundamentally misleading about my actual intentions. Most cleverly, I created fake supply movements and troop deployments that suggested I was preparing for exactly the kind of battle he excelled at winning. His intelligence network, which was normally his greatest asset, became the delivery system for his own destruction. Based on the false information I had carefully crafted, he prepared a brilliant strategy to defeat the army he thought I was fielding in the location he believed I had chosen for battle. The beauty of this approach was that every element of his plan was tactically sound. If my real strategy had been what he thought it was, his strategic thinking wasn't flawed. His strategic information was corrupted. He was solving the wrong problem with perfect logic. When we finally engaged, he discovered that nothing was as his intelligence had indicated. The forces he had prepared to counter didn't exist. The terrain advantages he had calculated were irrelevant because I wasn't fighting the battle he had planned for. His entire strategic framework collapsed because it was built on false foundations. The redirected arrow represents this principle perfectly. Instead of trying to block or avoid his strategic brilliance, I redirected it so that it struck where I wanted it to, not where he intended. His own intelligence gathering and planning process became the weapon I used to defeat him. This taught me that attacking strategy is superior to attacking strength, because strategy is what transforms strength into victory. A strong army with a flawed strategy will defeat itself. A weak army with a superior strategy can overcome apparently impossible odds. In modern contexts, this principle applies whenever you face opponents who seem to have every advantage. Instead of competing directly against their strengths, study their decision-making process. How do they gather information? What assumptions do they make? What factors do they consider most important when planning? Once you understand their strategic methodology, you can influence it without them realizing what's happening. You can shape the information they receive, the options they consider, the priorities they emphasize. You're not fighting their strength, you're redirecting it toward objectives that serve your interests instead of theirs. The most elegant victories come when your enemies defeat themselves by following their own logic, based on your carefully crafted inputs. They maintain confidence in their abilities right up until the moment they realize that their perfect plan was designed to solve the wrong problem. The greatest victory is when your enemy defeats himself while believing he is winning. This truth came to me through what I call the false retreat, a deception so complete that my enemies celebrated their triumph right up until the moment they realized they had destroyed themselves. I was facing a confederation of 3 warlords who had united specifically to crush my forces. Individually, I could have defeated any of them, but together they commanded nearly 4 times my numbers and had positioned themselves to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Conventional wisdom demanded that I avoid battle entirely, but I saw an opportunity hidden within their apparent advantage. The key insight was understanding that their unity was artificial, based on shared fear of me rather than genuine trust in each other. Each warlord secretly hoped the others would bear the heaviest losses, while he preserved his own strength for future opportunities. This hidden selfishness became the foundation for their destruction. I crafted a deception that would turn their greatest strength, their numerical superiority, to their greatest weakness. The plan required me to appear genuinely defeated and retreating in panic, which meant accepting real losses and genuine danger. Half-hearted deception is worse than no deception at all. I began by engaging their combined forces in a series of skirmishes where I allowed myself to be gradually pushed back. But these weren't random retreats. Withdrawal was carefully calculated to create specific impressions in the minds of my enemies. I wanted them to believe that my forces were demoralized, my supplies running low, and my strategic options eliminated. The critical moment came when I ordered what appeared to be a desperate night attack against their strongest position. I committed a significant portion of my army to this assault, knowing it would fail. My soldiers fought bravely, but were repelled with heavy casualties, and in the apparent chaos of retreat, I abandoned valuable supplies and equipment to my enemies. This looked like the death throes of a defeated army. They saw my desperation attack as proof that I had no other options left. The abandoned supplies convinced them that my logistics had collapsed. Most importantly, my heavy losses in the failed assault made them believe that my remaining forces were too weak to pose any serious threat. What they didn't realize was that the entire engagement was theater. The supplies I abandoned were deliberately staged to appear more valuable than they actually were. The casualties, while real, were carefully calculated could afford these losses because of what they would accomplish. The retreat routes I chose were designed to funnel their pursuit in exactly the direction I wanted. Each warlord, believing my army was broken, rushed to claim the largest share of the expected victory. Instead of maintaining their coordinated approach, they began competing with each other to capture me first. Their careful positioning dissolved as each force raced ahead, trying to outmaneuver their allies rather than their enemy. This is when the false retreat became a real trap. My supposedly demoralized army had actually taken positions in terrain that I had been maneuvering toward for weeks. When the three enemy forces arrived separately, each believing they were pursuing a beaten foe, they found themselves isolated and facing my concentrated strength in positions I had prepared specifically for this moment. The psychological impact was devastating. Each warlord realized simultaneously that his victory was actually a trap, that his allies had abandoned him to claim sole credit for my defeat, and that his army was now isolated and vulnerable. The confidence they had built through my apparent weakness transformed instantly into panic and recrimination. Within hours, the coalition that had seemed unbeatable was tearing itself apart. The warlords began retreating not from my forces, but from each other, each convinced that his allies had deliberately led him into a trap. Their mutual suspicions, which I had carefully cultivated through my deception, became more dangerous to them than my actual army. This taught me that the most powerful deceptions don't just hide your strength, they transform your enemy's strength into weakness. When you appear weak while actually being strong, you invite attacks that expose your enemies to counterattacks. When you appear defeated while actually being positioned for victory, you cause enemies to make the very moves that ensure their own destruction. The art lies in understanding that people see what they expect to see and believe what they want to believe. My enemies wanted to believe I was defeated because it confirmed their superiority and justified their alliance. By giving them exactly the evidence they craved, I led them to act on false assumptions that served my purposes perfectly. In modern applications, this principle works whenever you can make opponents overconfident by appearing weaker or more vulnerable than you actually are. When competitors underestimate you, they make careless moves that create opportunities. When opponents think they're winning, they often abandon the careful strategies that were actually keeping them safe. There is a moment in every psychological campaign when your enemies will hang in perfect balance. One precise strike can shatter it completely, while premature action will only strengthen their resolve. I learned to recognize this moment through what I call the perfect moment, an understanding of timing so precise it can end conflicts in a single decisive action. During a prolonged siege, I faced an enemy commander whose psychological fortress seemed impregnable. For months, I had applied various forms of mental pressure, spreading doubt among his troops, disrupting his supply lines, creating false intelligence about reinforcements that never came. Yet he maintained his composure and continued to resist. Effectively, I could have continued the siege indefinitely, gradually wearing down his defenses, but I recognized that time was becoming my enemy. The longer the siege continued, the more likely it became that political circumstances would force me to withdraw, or that enemy reinforcements would actually arrive. I needed to identify the exact moment when his psychological defenses would be most vulnerable to a decisive assault. The signs of readiness are subtle but unmistakable once you learn to recognize them. First, there are changes in decision-making patterns. A commander who once acted decisively begins hesitating, requesting more information before making choices that he would have made instantly when confident. Second, there are changes in communication. Leaders, under psychological pressure, begin over-explaining their decisions, seeking validation from subordinates instead of simply commanding. Most importantly, there are changes in what I call defensive behaviors. When someone's will is close to breaking, They begin protecting themselves psychologically in ways that actually reveal their vulnerability. They become defensive about topics they previously ignored. They react emotionally to provocations they once handled calmly. And they start making statements designed to convince themselves rather than others. I watched this enemy commander for weeks, noting these subtle shifts. The breakthrough moment came when my spies reported that he had begun asking his officers whether they thought his strategy was something he had never done before. This wasn't seeking advice. It was seeking reassurance. His inner confidence was cracking, and he was unconsciously looking for external validation to shore up his deteriorating self-belief. That night, I sent him a message that would have been ineffective weeks earlier, but was devastating at this precise moment of vulnerability. The message was simple. Your officers are beginning to doubt your judgment. Your men are starting to question whether you truly believe victory is possible. Perhaps it is time to consider whether continuing this resistance serves honor or merely delays the inevitable. The timing made all the difference. 3 months earlier, such a message would have strengthened his resolve by giving him something concrete to fight against, but delivered at the moment when his own inner doubts were already weakening his confidence. These words struck with the force of revealed truth rather than enemy propaganda. Within days, his psychological defenses collapsed completely. He began making increasingly erratic decisions, alternating between reckless aggression and paralyzing caution. His officers, sensing his uncertainty, started questioning orders they would have followed without hesitation when he projected confidence. The fortress fell not through assault, but through the commander's complete loss of psychological control. This experience taught me that psychological warfare has natural rhythms and cycles. Pressure applied too early will be ineffective because your enemy's mental defenses are still strong. Pressure applied too late may come after they have adapted to your methods and built new psychological fortifications. But pressure applied at the perfect moment when their defenses are already weakened but not yet collapse can achieve results that seem almost supernatural. The key to timing lies in patient observation combined with an understanding of psychological vulnerability. You must watch for the signs that your enemy's confidence is shifting from genuine certainty to manufactured bravado. When they start trying to convince themselves, rather than simply knowing, they have entered the zone of maximum vulnerability in modern contexts. This principle applies to any situation where you need to overcome resistance or change someone's mind. Whether in negotiations, workplace conflicts, or competitive situations, there are moments when people are psychologically ready to accept outcomes they would have rejected earlier. Recognizing these moments requires careful attention to changes in behavior, communication patterns, and decision-making styles. The perfect moment is always temporary. Miss it, and you may have to wait months or years for another opportunity. Strike too early, and you may strengthen the very resistance you're trying to overcome. But strike at exactly the right moment, and you can achieve victory so complete that your enemies will later wonder how they ever thought resistance was possible. Sometimes psychological warfare requires not the precision of a surgical strike, but the irresistible force of an avalanche. When facing enemies whose will is particularly strong, you must learn to apply mental pressure so overwhelming that their psychological defenses simply collapse under the weight. I discovered this through what I call the crushing weta visualization of psychological force that can break even the most stubborn resistance. I once faced a city-state whose ruler had sworn a sacred oath never to surrender to any foreign power. This wasn't mere political posturing, it was a religious conviction supported by the entire population. The city's walls were strong, their supplies adequate, and their morale unshakable because they believed that divine protection would reward their faithfulness. Traditional siege warfare would have taken years and cost thousands of lives. Instead of attacking their walls, I decided to attack their certainty. But this required more than clever tricks or isolated deceptions. Their faith was too strong for simple psychological manipulation. I needed to create a psychological assault so systematic and overwhelming that their entire worldview would crumble under sustained pressure. I began by identifying every source of confidence they possessed and systematically undermining each one. Their ruler drew strength from his reputation for wisdom, so I arranged for his past decisions to be questioned publicly through carefully planted information. Their priests maintained morale through prophecies of divine intervention, so I created omens that contradicted their predictions. But the real power came from coordinating multiple pressure points simultaneously. While they were dealing with questions about their leader's judgment, I was also disrupting their religious ceremonies with strategically timed natural events that suggested divine displeasure. While their priests struggled to explain contradictory omens, I was spreading rumors about the loyalty of their allies and the security of their escape routes. The key principle is that human minds can adapt to individual threats, but they break down when facing multiple unrelated pressures at the same time. A person can rationalize one piece of bad news, dismiss one ominous sign, or overcome one challenge to their beliefs. But when doubt attacks from every direction simultaneously, the psychological system becomes overloaded and begins to fail. I escalated the pressure gradually but relentlessly. Each week brought new reasons for uncertainty, new challenges to their assumptions, new evidence that their situation was more precarious than they had believed. Their religious confidence began competing with their political fears. Their trust in leadership conflicted with evidence of poor judgment. Their faith in divine protection clashed with increasingly ominous portents. The psychological assault reached its crescendo when I arranged for 3 devastating revelations to reach them within a single day. First, they learned that their most trusted ally had signed a secret treaty with me. Second, a solar eclipse occurred on the exact day their high priest had predicted divine favor would be most apparent. Third, they discovered that their sacred treasury had been systematically embezzled by the very officials responsible for organizing their resistance. This was the crushing weight in action, not one overwhelming blow, but multiple devastating pressures applied simultaneously until their psychological defenses simply couldn't cope. Each individual revelation might have been manageable, but together they created a cascade of doubt that destroyed their will to resist. The effect was immediate and total. Within hours of these revelations, the ruler who had sworn never to surrender was sending envoys to negotiate terms. The population that had been prepared to die for their beliefs was opening the gates and welcoming my forces as liberators from the uncertainty and chaos their previous leaders had brought upon them. This taught me that overwhelming psychological pressure succeeds not through the magnitude of any single attack, but through the coordination of multiple attacks that prevent the enemy from recovering their balance. When you strike at their confidence while simultaneously undermining their relationships, questioning their beliefs, and threatening their security, you create a psychological storm that no individual mental defense can withstand. The modern applications are profound. When facing particularly stubborn opponents in business, politics, or personal conflicts, you can apply this principle by identifying all the sources of their confidence and applying pressure to each one systematically. Don't rely on a single argument or threat. Create multiple independent reasons for them to reconsider their position. However, this power must be used with great care. Overwhelming psychological pressure can break people permanently, and there are ethical boundaries that should never be crossed. The goal is to break their resistance to your objectives, not to destroy their capacity for recovery and future cooperation. When applied properly, the crushing weight achieves faster victory with less overall damage than prolonged conflict. But when misused, it can create enemies who will never forgive and who will become permanently dedicated to your destruction. The power to overwhelm minds completely is also the responsibility to use that power wisely. Fear is the foundation of all psychological weakness, and mastering its cultivation is essential to breaking enemy will. But fear alone is crude. It must be refined into doubt and uncertainty to achieve maximum effectiveness. Through what I call the seeds of doubt, I learned to plant psychological vulnerabilities that grow into complete mental paralysis without the enemy understanding how their confidence was destroyed. The most instructive campaign of my career involved an enemy whose strength came not from superior numbers or better position, but from absolute certainty in his cause. This general believed he was destined by heaven to unify the warring states under his rule. His conviction was so complete that it infected his entire army with unshakable confidence. They fought like men who knew victory was inevitable because their leader had convinced them it was divinely ordained. I realized that direct attacks against such faith would only strengthen it by giving them something concrete to resist. Instead, I needed to introduce subtle uncertainties that would gradually corrupt their certainty from within. The goal wasn't to make them afraid of me, but to make them doubt themselves, their leader, and ultimately their entire understanding of their situation. I began by identifying the 3 types of doubt that destroy human confidence most effectively. The first is self-doubt, questioning one's own judgment, abilities, or worthiness. The second is doubt in leadership, questioning whether those in authority are competent, honest, or truly committed to their followers' welfare. The third is doubt in victory, questioning whether the cause can actually succeed regardless of personal merit or leadership quality. Self-doubt was the easiest to cultivate because it already existed beneath the surface. Even the most confident warriors harbor secret uncertainties about their courage, skill, or preparation. I arranged for my enemies to face unexpected challenges that revealed limitations they hadn't known they possessed. Nothing devastating, just enough difficulty to make them question whether they were as capable as they had believed. I had small groups of my forces appear and disappear in impossible locations, creating the impression that my army possessed supernatural mobility. When enemy patrols investigated these sightings, they found evidence of recent occupation, but no trace of how my forces had arrived or departed. This made them doubt their own tracking abilities and question whether they truly understood the tactical situation. Doubt in leadership required more sophisticated manipulation. I couldn't directly attack their general's reputation without triggering defensive loyalty. Instead, I created situations where his decisions, while not obviously wrong, led to unexpected complications. I arranged for supply deliveries to be delayed just enough to cause inconvenience, for reinforcements to arrive slightly later than promised, for intelligence reports to be subtly inaccurate. None of these problems were dramatic enough to constitute clear failures, but they created a pattern of small disappointments that gradually eroded confidence in leadership competence. Soldiers began privately questioning whether their general was as masterful as they had believed, not because of any major mistake, but because of accumulated minor frustrations that suggested fallibility. The most devastating was doubt in victory itself. This required attacking their fundamental assumptions about their divinely ordained success. I created false evidence suggesting that other armies with similar divine confidence had met unexpected defeats. I spread stories about prophecies that had been misinterpreted and destinies that had been thwarted by unforeseen circumstances. Most effectively, I arranged for them to witness my forces performing rituals and ceremonies that suggested I also believed I had divine favor. This created the terrifying possibility that heaven might be supporting both sides, or worse, that their understanding of divine will might be mistaken. The psychological campaign reached its climax during a series of skirmishes where I allowed them to win tactical victories while ensuring that each victory costs more than expected and accomplished less than hoped. They were winning individual battles, but somehow losing strategic momentum, succeeding in combat but failing to progress toward their ultimate objective. This created the most devastating doubt of all, the suspicion that victory itself might be meaningless. They began to question not just whether they would win, but whether winning would actually achieve what they had been promised. When people doubt the value of victory, they lose the will to pursue it even when success seems probable. The end came, not through any dramatic battle, but through a gradual collapse of morale as accumulated doubts overwhelmed their original confidence. The general who had once radiated certainty became hesitant and defensive. The army that had marched with absolute faith began questioning orders and seeking reassurance for decisions they would have executed without hesitation months earlier. This taught me that fear is temporary and can be overcome, but doubt is permanent and grows stronger over time. When you plant seeds of uncertainty in enemy minds, you create weapons that continue attacking their confidence long after your initial intervention. The most elegant psychological victories come when enemies defeat themselves through their own growing doubts about abilities, leadership, and objectives they once considered unquestionable. In modern applications, this principle works whenever you can introduce reasonable questions about assumptions your opponents take for granted. The key is subtle to doubts that seem to arise naturally from experience are far more powerful than doubts that appear to be externally imposed. An enemy with allies is 10 times stronger than an enemy standing alone, but allies bound together by fear or convenience are also 10 times more vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The greatest victory I ever achieved came through what I call the severed bond, the systematic destruction of an enemy coalition without striking a single blow against any individual member. I faced the most dangerous situation of my military career when 7 rival warlords set aside their mutual hatred to unite against me. Individually, each commanded forces roughly equal to mine. United, they represented an overwhelming superiority that made conventional victory impossible. Worse, their hatred of me was so intense that it overcame generations of bitter conflicts between them. The traditional approach would have been to retreat and avoid battle until the coalition collapsed naturally through internal disputes. But I recognized that their fear of me was so great that it might hold them together indefinitely. Instead, I needed to actively destroy their unity by exploiting the psychological dynamics that make alliances both powerful and fragile. Every alliance contains hidden tensions that exist below the surface of cooperation. Partners may share common goals, but they rarely share identical interests. The warlords opposing me all wanted me defeated, but each had different visions of what should happen afterward. Some sought territorial expansion, others wanted trade, advantages, and a few simply craved the prestige of participating in my downfall. I began by carefully studying the relationship dynamics within their coalition. Through spies and careful observation, I identified which leaders trusted each other least, which partnerships were newest and most fragile, and which members secretly resented having to share glory with rivals they considered inferior. The key insight was that alliance solidarity depends on each member believing that their partners are fully committed to shared sacrifice. When doubt creeps in about whether allies are truly pulling their weight or are instead pursuing hidden agendas, cooperation transforms into suspicion and eventually into active hostility. I started with the most subtle interventions possible. I arranged for intelligence to reach certain warlords, suggesting that their allies were holding back their best troops while expecting others to bear the heaviest casualties. I created false evidence that some coalition members were secretly negotiating better post-victory positions, while publicly advocating equal partnership. The genius of this approach was that I didn't need to convince anyone that their allies were actively betraying them. I only needed to plant reasonable doubts about whether their allies were as committed as they claimed to be. Once these doubts took root, the coalition members began watching each other for signs of disloyalty instead of focusing entirely on our shared conflict. The psychological pressure, built through a series of coordinated deceptions, I would leak information to one warlord about another's troop movements, but present it in a way that suggested secretive maneuvering rather than legitimate tactical coordination. I would create situations where coalition members arrived at rendezvous points at slightly different times, then ensure that rumors circulated about deliberate delays and hidden motives. Most effectively, I exploited their competitive natures by creating artificial scarcities that forced them to choose between cooperation and self. When opportunities arose for glory, resources, or strategic advantage, I ensured that these opportunities required coalition members to compete with each other rather than cooperate against me. The decisive break came when I arranged for two warlords to receive contradictory intelligence about my army's location. Each believed he had exclusive access to crucial information that would allow him to claim the primary glory for my defeat. Instead of sharing this intelligence, both leaders positioned their forces to take advantage of what they thought was superior knowledge when they discovered that they had been maneuvered into competing with each other rather than coordinating against me. The psychological damage was irreversible. Each realized that his ally had been willing to risk overall victory for personal advantage. The trust that held their coalition together shattered instantly and completely within days. The alliance that had seemed unbreakable was destroying itself through recriminations and accusations. Former allies began positioning their armies to defend against each other rather than attack me. What had been my greatest threat became my greatest asset as 7 separate enemies replaced one unified force. This experience taught me that isolating enemies through alliance destruction is often more effective than defeating them through direct confrontation. When you can turn allies against each other, you multiply your effective strength while diminishing theirs. The psychological warfare creates lasting damage that continues weakening your opponents long after the immediate crisis has passed. In modern applications, this principle works whenever you face opponents who derive strength from partnerships or group solidarity. By understanding the hidden tensions within any alliance and creating situations that force partners to choose between group loyalty and individual advantage, you can often achieve victory through division rather than through superior force. The most devastating weapon in psychological warfare is not cunning or deception, but patience itself. Time erodes the strongest will more surely than any direct assault, and those who master the art of waiting can defeat enemies who seem unconquerable through immediate action. I learned this through what I call the waiting stone, a reminder that time breaks all resistance for those wise enough to let it work. My longest and most instructive campaign lasted 2 years and taught me that patience is not passive endurance, but active strategy. I faced a mountain fortress commanded by a leader whose psychological defenses seemed impenetrable. He was experienced, disciplined, well-supplied, and completely confident in his ability to outlast any siege. His position was so strong that direct assault would have been suicidal, and traditional siege warfare would have taken decades. But I recognized something. His confidence prevented him from seeing time was my ally, not his. While his fortress was strong, it was also isolated. While his supplies were adequate, they were not infinite. Most importantly, while his confidence was genuine, it was based on assumptions that would become less valid with each passing month. The psychological siege begins with accepting that victory will not come quickly or dramatically. This requires a different kind of mental discipline than battlefield tactics demand. You must maintain strategic pressure consistently over extended periods while resisting the natural human urge for immediate results or dramatic action. I established a loose containment around the fortress not tight enough to trigger desperate breakout attempts, but sufficient to control information flow and gradually restrict options. The key was making the siege feel sustainable to my forces while slowly making it feel unsustainable to the defenders. The first phase focused on controlling narrative and information. I ensured that news reaching the fortress was carefully filtered to emphasize the strength and permanence of my position while subtly undermining confidence in outside support. Not through obvious lies that would be dismissed, but through selective truth that painted an increasingly discouraging picture of the defenders' long-term prospects. The second phase involved gradual escalation of inconveniences. Supply deliveries became less reliable, communications with the outside world grew more difficult, and small luxuries that made life bearable began disappearing. Each change was minor enough to adapt to individually, but together they created a slowly deteriorating quality of life that eroded morale imperceptibly. The third phase targeted hope itself. I made sure the defenders learned about other fortresses that had eventually fallen, other commanders who had ultimately surrendered, other sieges that had ended in negotiated withdrawal rather than glorious victory. Again, nothing dramatic or obviously threatening, just accumulated evidence that their situation, while currently manageable, was following a familiar pattern. Throughout this process, I maintained perfect patience. When subordinates urged more aggressive action, I reminded them that we were fighting time, not just terrain. When political pressure mounted for quicker results, I demonstrated how our methodical approach was steadily weakening an enemy that direct assault could never have touched. The psychological turning point came in the 18th month when the fortress commander began sending envoys to discuss terms not for surrender, but for clarification of intentions. This was the first crack in his confidence, the moment when absolute certainty began transforming into managed uncertainty. I handled these overtures with careful balance. I was respectful enough to maintain his dignity, but firm enough to make clear that his position was steadily weakening. I offered reasonable terms that would become less favorable over time, creating pressure to act sooner rather than later, while avoiding the desperation that might trigger final resistance. The siege ended not with battle or surrender, but with negotiated withdrawal. The commander evacuated his fortress with honor intact, his forces undefeated in combat, but his will to continue resistance completely broken by the steady erosion of hope and the gradual recognition that time was making his position untenable. This experience taught me that patience is most powerful when combined with consistent pressure and clear consequences for delay. The enemy must understand that their situation is deteriorating, but slowly enough that they always feel they have time to adapt or negotiate. When you create this psychological dynamic, time becomes a weapon that never misses and never fails. The modern applications are profound. In business negotiations, workplace conflicts, or competitive situations, the person who can maintain consistent pressure while waiting for optimal timing usually defeats the person who needs immediate results. Markets, relationships, and opportunities all change over time, and patience allows you to benefit from these changes rather than fighting against them. Most people lose psychological wars not because their position is weak, but because they cannot endure uncertainty long enough for their advantages to manifest. They make premature compromises, accept unfavorable terms, or abandon superior strategies because they cannot tolerate the discomfort of extended conflict. The waiting stone reminds us that the greatest victories often come to those who can outlast, rather than outfight their opponents. When you combine patience with strategic pressure, you create a force that grows stronger over time while your enemies grow weaker, until surrender becomes their most rational option. Knowledge is power, but the strategic use of knowledge is domination. The difference between information and intelligence lies not in what you know, but in how you use what you know to destroy your enemy's confidence in their own understanding. Through what I call the network of whispers, I learned to transform superior intelligence into psychological supremacy that made victory inevitable before battles were even fought. Intelligence warfare operates on two levels simultaneously. The obvious level involves gathering information about enemy capabilities, positions, and intentions. But the deeper level involves using your superior knowledge to convince enemies that they understand neither their situation nor their options. When opponents realize that you know things they don't, and that their decisions are based on incomplete or incorrect information, their confidence collapses. I developed this understanding during a campaign against a rival who was renowned for his intelligence network. His spies were everywhere. His information was usually accurate, and his strategic decisions were based on careful analysis of reliable data. On paper, his intelligence capabilities were superior to mine. In practice, I used his strength against him by controlling the quality and interpretation of the information he received. The first principle of intelligence warfare is that people see patterns where they expect to see patterns, and they interpret information in ways that confirm their existing beliefs. My enemy expected to gather intelligence through traditional methods: interrogating prisoners, observing troop movements, intercepting communications. I gave him exactly what he expected, but I carefully controlled what he found. I created false patterns that looked like genuine intelligence while hiding my real intentions beneath layers of misdirection. When his spies captured my messengers, they found authentic-looking documents containing carefully crafted misinformation. When his scouts observed my forces, they saw movements that suggested strategies I had no intention of implementing. But the real genius was in creating intelligence that was technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. I would move troops to positions that my enemy could observe, but I timed these movements to suggest preparations for attacks I wasn't planning. I held meetings that his agents could witness, but I ensured these meetings discussed contingency plans rather than actual intentions. The psychological impact built gradually as my enemy's intelligence network fed him information that was consistently accurate in detail but wrong in interpretation. His spies reported what they saw correctly, but what they saw was designed to create false impressions. His analysis was logical based on the data he possessed, but the data had been carefully selected to support incorrect conclusions. The breakthrough came when I realized that I could use his intelligence successes against him. Each time his network successfully gathered information, I ensured that the information suggested that I was less prepared, less informed, or more vulnerable than I actually was. His intelligence victories became psychological defeats because they gave him false confidence based on incomplete understanding. The decisive demonstration of intelligence superiority came during a battle where I anticipated his every move, 3 steps in advance, not because I was a superior tactician, but because I understood his decision-making process better than he understood mine. I knew what intelligence he possessed, how he would interpret it, and what conclusions he would reach. When the battle began, I countered his strategies before he fully implemented them. I positioned forces to defend against attacks he was still planning. I struck at objectives he thought were secret. I anticipated his retreat routes and positioned troops to intercept forces he didn't realize he would need to move. The psychological effect was devastating. He realized that I wasn't just defeating his tactics, I was demonstrating that I understood his mind better than he understood mine. Every decision he made revealed that I had predicted it. Every surprise he attempted proved that he had no surprises left. After the battle, he approached my tent under a flag of truce and asked a question that revealed complete psychological defeat. "How long have you been reading my thoughts?" This wasn't a request for tactical information. It was an admission that he no longer trusted his own judgment because I had demonstrated superior insight into his. decision-making process. This experience taught me that intelligence warfare's ultimate goal is not just to know more than your enemy, but to make your enemy doubt what they think they know. When opponents realize that their understanding of the situation is incomplete or incorrect, they lose confidence in their ability to make sound decisions. The modern applications are powerful in any competitive environment, in business, politics, or personal conflicts. Demonstrating that you understand the situation better than your opponents do creates psychological advantages that extend far beyond the immediate tactical benefits. When people doubt their own grasp of reality, they become vulnerable to influence and manipulation. The network of whispers represents the understanding that information flows like water. It finds the channels you create for it. When you control these channels, you control not just what people know, but how they think about what they know. This power to shape understanding and interpretation becomes the foundation for all other forms of psychological dominance. Superior intelligence creates superiority in confidence, and superiority in confidence creates superiority in everything else. When your enemies doubt their understanding while you remain certain of yours, victory becomes not just probable but inevitable. There comes a moment in every psychological campaign when your enemy's defenses have been systematically weakened to the point where one final, concentrated assault can shatter their will completely. Recognizing this moment and executing the decisive strike requires what I call the decisive moment, the perfect convergence of preparation, opportunity, and overwhelming force that ends resistance permanently. The most critical campaign of my career demonstrated this principle when I faced an enemy whose psychological resilience seemed limitless. For months, I had applied every technique of mental warfare, strategic deception, alliance breaking, intelligence manipulation, and gradual pressure. Yet this opponent continued to resist with remarkable tenacity, adapting to each new psychological assault and maintaining his army's fighting spirit despite accumulating disadvantages. I realized that partial psychological victories were actually strengthening his position by proving that he could survive my attacks. Each time he weathered another mental assault, his confidence grew stronger rather than weaker. I needed to shift strategies from gradual erosion to complete annihilation of his will to resist. The key to recognizing when an enemy is ready for final psychological defeat lies in understanding the difference between resilient resistance and desperate resistance. A resilient enemy adapts and grows stronger through challenge. A desperate enemy maintains the appearance of strength while internally acknowledging that their position is deteriorating beyond recovery. I watched for specific indicators that revealed the true state of his psychological defenses. First, his decision-making began showing signs of fatigue. Choices that once came quickly now required extended deliberation. Second, his communication shifted from confident assertions to defensive justifications. Third, his tactical innovations became increasingly desperate and risky rather than creative and effective. Most telling was a change in how he responded to setbacks. Early in our conflict, defeats energized him to find new approaches and rally his forces. Now, defeats prompted longer recovery periods and visible frustration that he couldn't hide from his subordinates. His resilience was transforming into brittleness. The psychological assault I designed was unlike anything I had attempted before. Instead of attacking one aspect of his position, I coordinated simultaneous strikes against every source of his remaining confidence. I didn't want to weaken him further. I wanted to destroy his ability to resist entirely. The operation began with intelligence revelations that exposed the depth of my knowledge about his organization. I demonstrated that I knew details about his personal relationships, his private fears, his secret strategic reserves, and his backup plans. This wasn't just tactical superiority, was proof that his most intimate thoughts and careful preparations were transparent to me. simultaneously. I activated every alliance, relationship, and political connection I had cultivated over months of careful preparation. Former allies publicly abandoned him. Neutral parties declared support for my position. And enemy forces faced the reality that they were completely isolated in a hostile world. The decisive psychological blow came through what appeared to be a minor tactical engagement, but was actually a carefully orchestrated demonstration of total superiority. I didn't just defeat his forces, I anticipated their every move, countered their every strategy, and accomplished objectives they didn't realize existed until after I had achieved them. The battle itself was secondary to its psychological impact. I made it clear that I wasn't just winning through superior resources or lucky circumstances. I was operating on a level of strategic understanding that made resistance not just difficult but meaningless. His every tactical choice revealed that I had already planned for it and prepared countermeasures. The moment of complete psychological break came when he realized that I had been orchestrating events for months, specifically to create this exact situation. Every previous engagement, every diplomatic interaction, every intelligence operation had been designed to position him for this final demonstration of helplessness. His surrender came, not through military defeat, but through the recognition that continued resistance would only prove his complete inability to oppose my will effectively. He didn't capitulate because he was beaten. He capitulated because he understood that he had never really been fighting me so much as following a script I had written for him. This experience taught me that final psychological assault requires perfect timing and overwhelming force. If you strike too early, before the enemy's defenses are sufficiently weakened, you may strengthen their resolve by giving them something dramatic to rally against. If you wait too long, they may recover their psychological balance and rebuild their resistance. But when executed at the perfect moment with sufficient force, the final assault achieves something more valuable than mere victory. It creates lasting psychological submission that prevents future challenges. The enemy doesn't just lose. They lose confidence in their ability to oppose you effectively under any circumstances. In modern applications, this principle applies when you need to end conflicts definitively rather than simply winning individual battles. Whether in business, competition, workplace disputes, or personal confrontations, there are moments when decisive psychological action can resolve underlying tensions permanently rather than temporarily. The most dangerous moment in any psychological campaign comes after victory, when your defeated enemy must choose between acceptance and revenge. A broken will that is not properly healed becomes a source of permanent hatred that will eventually threaten you again. Through what I call the healing bomb, I learned to transform psychological defeat into psychological transformation, turning former enemies into future allies. I discovered this principle during the aftermath of my most complete victory, when I had utterly shattered an enemy's will to resist through months of systematic psychological warfare. His surrender was total, his forces disbanded, and his territory under my control. By every measure, I had achieved perfect triumph. Yet I realized that my victory was incomplete and potentially dangerous. The defeated commander was a man of considerable ability, whose humiliation was so complete that he faced a choice between accepting his defeat with dignity or dedicating his remaining life to seeking revenge. If he chose revenge, his intelligence and determination would eventually create threats I couldn't anticipate. If he chose acceptance, those same qualities could become assets for my future endeavors. The key insight was understanding that psychological victory creates a moment of maximum influence over your enemy's future choices. Their will is broken, their confidence shattered, and their understanding of their position fundamentally altered. In this vulnerable state, they are more open to redefining their relationship with you than they will ever be again. I approached him not as a conqueror, addressing a defeated foe, but as a superior strategist offering to share wisdom with someone capable of appreciating its value. I acknowledged his abilities while making clear that his defeat had come through gaps in understanding rather than personal inadequacy. This framing allowed him to accept defeat without accepting worthlessness. The conversation focused on what he had learned through our conflict rather than what he had lost. I demonstrated that his defeat had been educational rather than merely destructive, that he now understood aspects of strategy and psychology that he had never grasped before. His humiliation transformed into enlightenment. His loss became gain in wisdom. Most critically, I offered him a path forward that honored his capabilities while preventing future conflict. Instead of exile or imprisonment, I invited him to serve in a position that would utilize his talents while ensuring his loyalty, not as a subordinate accepting charity, but as a professional recognizing an opportunity to learn. From a superior master, this approach succeeded because it addressed the psychological needs that drive revenge-seeking behavior. People pursue revenge when they feel that their defeat was unfair, when their worth has been denied, or when they believe they have no honorable path forward. By addressing each of these concerns, I eliminated the emotional foundation that supports prolonged hatred. The healing process required careful balance between maintaining clear authority and restoring damaged dignity. I never pretended that we were equals or that his defeat was somehow mutual, but I made clear that his value as a person and a strategist remained intact despite his tactical failures. The defeat reflected gaps in knowledge and preparation, not inherent inadequacy. Over the following months, I watched his transformation from bitter enemy to loyal supporter. His initial cooperation was calculated self-interest, but gradually it became genuine appreciation for the opportunity to learn from someone whose abilities he had experienced firsthand. His former hatred transformed into professional respect, and eventually into personal loyalty. This experience taught me that consolidating psychological victory requires as much skill as achieving it. You must break your enemy's will to resist, while preserving their capacity for future cooperation. You must demonstrate superiority while maintaining respect for their dignity. You must establish clear dominance while offering paths to restoration. Modern applications are crucial in any competitive environment where you may face the same opponents repeatedly. In business, politics, or personal relationships, complete victory without proper consolidation often creates permanent enemies who will seek revenge through future opportunities. But victory followed by skillful relationship management can transform competitors into collaborators. The healing bomb represents the understanding that psychological warfare's ultimate goal should be lasting peace rather than temporary dominance. When you break someone's will to oppose you while preserving their ability to support you, you achieve something more valuable than victory. You achieve transformation. True mastery of psychological warfare includes knowing when to stop attacking and start healing. The greatest strategic minds understand that former enemies who choose loyalty through enlightenment become more valuable allies than friends who have never been tested through conflict. Their loyalty is based on proven respect for your abilities rather than untested personal affection. When you master both the destruction and restoration of human will, you possess the complete art of psychological dominance, the power to reshape relationships and transform conflict into cooperation through the skillful management of victory itself. The master of psychological warfare must also be the master of psychological defense. Those who can break the will of enemies while remaining immune to similar attacks possess the complete art of mental dominance. Through what I call the reflective shield, I learned to not only protect my mind from enemy psychological assault, but to turn these attacks back upon their creators with devastating effect. My education in psychological defense came through necessity when I faced an opponent who had studied my methods and attempted to use them against me. This enemy understood the principles of mental warfare and possessed the patience and intelligence to apply them skillfully. For the first time in my career, I found myself the target of systematic psychological attack rather than its architect. The experience was both humbling and enlightening. I discovered that being subjected to psychological warfare feels entirely different from conducting it. When you're the target, the techniques that seem elegant and subtle when you use them feel overwhelming and disorienting when applied against you. Understanding this difference is crucial for developing effective defenses. The first sign of psychological attack is often subtle changes in your decision-making process. Questions that once seemed straightforward begin feeling complicated. Choices that you would normally make confidently require longer deliberation. Information that should be clear becomes ambiguous, and simple situations start appearing more complex than they actually are. I noticed these changes in myself before I identified their source. My enemy was feeding false intelligence into my information network, but doing so gradually and subtly enough that the corruption wasn't immediately obvious. He was creating minor disruptions in my communications and supply lines, nothing dramatic enough to constitute obvious sabotage, but sufficient to create accumulating frustration and doubt. The reflective shield begins with recognizing that you are under psychological attack. This requires honest self-assessment and the ability to distinguish between legitimate concerns and artificially induced uncertainties. When your confidence begins eroding without clear cause, when problems multiply without obvious sources, when decisions become more difficult despite unchanging circumstances, you are likely facing intentional psychological manipulation. Once I identified the attack, I could begin defending against it. The first layer of defense is returning to your fundamental principles and core certainties. I reviewed my strategic objectives, confirmed my tactical capabilities, and reaffirmed my understanding of the overall situation based on information I knew to be reliable. This provided a stable foundation that couldn't be shaken by external manipulation. The second layer involves systematic analysis of incoming information and apparent problems. Instead of reacting to each issue individually, I began looking for patterns that might reveal coordinated deception. I traced information back to its sources, verified claims through independent channels, and tested whether apparent crises had logical explanations or seemed artificially created. But the most powerful defense is transforming psychological attack into psychological counterattack. Once you understand how your enemy is trying to manipulate your mind, you can use that knowledge to manipulate theirs more effectively. The reflective shield doesn't just block incoming attacks, it redirects them back toward their source with amplified force. I began feeding my enemy false evidence that his psychological warfare was succeeding beyond his expectations. I allowed him to believe that I was more confused, more uncertain, and more psychologically vulnerable than I actually was. This encouraged him to escalate his attacks and commit more resources to techniques that I was now immune to. Meanwhile, I used my understanding of his psychological warfare methods to design counterattacks specifically tailored to his mental vulnerabilities. Since he was focused on attacking my confidence, I attacked his patience. Since he was trying to create uncertainty in my decision-making, I created false certainty in his information gathering. Since he was attempting to isolate me from reliable intelligence, I fed him intelligence that seemed reliable but was carefully crafted to support false conclusions. The decisive moment came when I revealed that I had been aware of his psychological attacks from their beginning and had been using his attempts at manipulation to manipulate him more effectively. The realization that his carefully planned mental assault had been turned into a weapon against him was psychologically devastating. This experience taught me that psychological defense requires both passive protection and active counterattack. You must shield your mind from external manipulation while using your enemy's attacks as opportunities to attack them more effectively. The best defense becomes offense when you can turn enemy psychological weapons back against their creators. The modern applications are essential in any competitive environment where psychological manipulation is possible. In business negotiations, workplace conflicts, or personal relationships, the ability to recognize and defend against mental manipulation while turning these attacks to your advantage creates decisive superiority over opponents who rely on psychological tactics. The reflective shield represents the understanding that true psychological strength comes not from avoiding mental attacks, but from transforming them into opportunities for victory. When your enemy's attempts to break your will become tools for breaking theirs, you achieve the supreme mastery of psychological warfare, the ability to win through your enemy's own attacks against you. The capacity for psychological warfare is not a natural talent that some possess and others lack. It is a skill that can be developed through systematic training and disciplined practice. Through what I call the daily discipline, I developed a comprehensive training regimen that sharpened the mental abilities necessary for breaking enemy will while fortifying my own psychological defenses. The journey from conventional warrior to master of psychological warfare required transforming not just my tactical thinking, but my entire approach to understanding human nature and conflict. This transformation came through years of deliberate practice in specific mental disciplines that most generals never even consider developing. The first discipline is developing enhanced observation of human behavior. Most people see only the obvious aspects of others' actions and communications. They notice what people say and do, but miss the subtle indicators that reveal true thoughts, feelings, and intentions. I trained myself to read the invisible signs that betray psychological states. I would spend hours studying my own officers during routine activities, learning to identify the micro-expressions that indicated doubt, the body language that revealed confidence, the speech patterns that suggested deception or uncertainty. I practiced this observation until I could assess someone's psychological state within minutes of meeting them. The second discipline involves systematic study of decision-making patterns. Different personality types approach choices in predictable ways, and understanding these patterns allows you to anticipate reactions and manipulate outcomes. I developed detailed profiles of various psychological types and tested my ability to predict their responses to different stimuli. I would present scenarios to my subordinates and observe not just what decisions they made, but how they made them. Did they seek consensus or decide independently? Did they focus on immediate consequences or long-term implications? Did they prioritize safety or opportunity? These patterns became templates I could apply when facing similar personality types among my enemies. The third discipline is practicing emotional detachment while maintaining strategic empathy. You must understand what others feel without being influenced by those emotions yourself. This requires developing the ability to step inside another person's perspective completely while keeping your own judgment clear and objective. I would imagine myself in various challenging situations and practice maintaining calm, strategic thinking while experiencing simulated emotional pressure. I would deliberately expose myself to frustrating or frightening circumstances to build tolerance for psychological stress, while preserving decision-making clarity. The fourth discipline involves developing multiple strategic thinking approaches simultaneously. Most people think linearly, planning one strategy and committing to it. Psychological warfare requires holding several possible approaches in your mind at once, ready to shift between them based on changing circumstances and emerging opportunities. I practiced this by analyzing historical battles and developing alternative strategies for each side, then gaming out how these different approaches would interact. I trained myself to think like multiple different commanders simultaneously, understanding how various strategic philosophies would respond to the same situation. The fifth discipline is cultivating strategic patience through delayed gratification exercises. Psychological warfare often requires waiting months or years for the right moment to strike, and most people lack the mental discipline to maintain focus and pressure over such extended periods. I would set myself challenges that required sustained effort without immediate reward, learning complex skills, completing lengthy projects, or maintaining difficult practices purely for the mental discipline they developed. This built the psychological endurance necessary for extended campaigns. The sixth discipline involves systematic deception practice in low-stakes situations. The ability to create false impressions convincingly is crucial for psychological warfare, but it requires practice to develop the subtle skills of misdirection without obvious dishonesty. I would practice creating specific impressions in social situations, appearing more or less confident, knowledgeable, or concerned than I actually was. I learned to control my unconscious signals while reading the unconscious signals of others. This became second nature through constant, careful practice. The seventh discipline is developing comprehensive scenario planning abilities. Psychological warfare requires anticipating how various psychological pressures will affect different personality types under changing circumstances. This demands the ability to think through complex chains of cause and effect involving human psychology. I would design elaborate mental exercises where I imagined applying various psychological techniques to different enemy types and gaming out the likely responses, counter-responses, and eventual outcomes. This built the strategic imagination necessary for complex psychological campaigns. The final discipline involves maintaining ethical boundaries while developing psychological dominance capabilities. The power to break human will carries enormous responsibility, and training must include developing the wisdom to use this power appropriately, rather than simply the ability to use it effectively. I regularly reflected on the long-term consequences of psychological warfare techniques, the difference between breaking enemy resistance and breaking enemy humanity, and the importance of maintaining my own moral compass while exercising psychological power over others. These disciplines must be practiced daily and integrated into a comprehensive development program. Like physical training for warriors, psychological training for mental warfare requires consistent effort over extended periods to develop genuine capability. The daily discipline represents the understanding that psychological warfare mastery demands the same systematic preparation as any other advanced skill. Natural talent may provide a foundation, but only deliberate practice and disciplined training can develop the complete capabilities necessary for consistent success in mental conflict. Modern practitioners can adapt these disciplines to develop psychological awareness and influence capabilities relevant to business, politics, and personal relationships. The same mental skills that won ancient battles can provide decisive advantages in contemporary competitive environments. As I reflect on a lifetime spent mastering the art of breaking human will, I am struck by the profound responsibility that comes with such power. The principles I have shared with you represent more than military tactics. They are tools for understanding and influencing the deepest aspects of human nature. Through what I call the eternal flame, I pass to you wisdom that must burn brightly but never consume those who wield it. The greatest lesson of my career is that the supreme excellence in breaking enemy will lies not in the destruction of your opponents, but in their transformation. When you possess the power to shatter minds, you also possess the power to rebuild them stronger and wiser. The choice between destruction and transformation defines the difference between a conqueror and a true master. I have shown you how to identify psychological weaknesses, exploit mental vulnerabilities, and systematically dismantle the confidence that enables resistance. These techniques are devastatingly effective when properly applied, but effectiveness without wisdom is dangerous not only to your enemies, but to yourself. The corruption that comes from wielding psychological power carelessly can destroy the wielder more surely than any external enemy. The principles of psychological warfare that I have taught you are eternal because human nature itself is eternal. The same fears, desires, and mental patterns that drove people in my time continue to drive people in yours. Political systems change, technologies evolve, but the fundamental psychology of will, confidence, and submission remains constant across all eras. What has changed is the scale and speed at which these principles can be applied. In my time, psychological warfare affected armies and kingdoms. In your time, the same techniques can influence millions of people simultaneously through communication networks that span the globe. This multiplication of impact makes wisdom and restraint more crucial than ever. The legacy I want to leave is not just knowledge of how to break human will, but understanding of when and why such power should be exercised. The ability to destroy someone's confidence and resistance is a capability that should be reserved for situations where such extreme measures serve justice, protection, or the greater good. Use these techniques to defend against those who would manipulate and exploit others. Apply them to overcome obstacles that prevent you from achieving worthy objectives. Employ them to establish necessary authority and create beneficial order. But never use them for petty revenge, personal aggrandizement, or the mere pleasure of dominating others. Remember that every mind you break was once someone's child, someone's hope for the future, someone's love. The power to shatter human will comes with the obligation to use that power in service of something greater than yourself. When you break someone's resistance, you become responsible for what they become afterward. The eternal flame represents the understanding that true mastery of psychological warfare transcends the ability to win conflicts. It encompasses the wisdom to know which conflicts are worth winning, and how to win them in ways that create lasting benefit rather than temporary advantage. In your modern world, you will face opponents in business who seem unbeatable, colleagues who undermine your efforts, competitors who threaten your success. The principles I have taught you can help you overcome these challenges through mental dominance rather than exhausting confrontation. But always remember that your ultimate goal should be creating conditions for mutual prosperity and cooperation, not simply establishing your superiority over others. Carry forward what I have taught you with honor, wisdom, and restraint. The eternal flame illuminates your path to victory, while never burning those who cross your path unnecessarily. Master the art of breaking will so completely that you rarely need to use it, because your reputation for psychological mastery becomes a deterrent that prevents conflicts before they begin. The greatest victory is the one that transforms enemies into allies, competitors into collaborators, and conflict into cooperation. When you achieve such transformative power through mastery of human psychology, you honor the legacy of these ancient principles while adapting them to serve the needs of your time. Go forward and apply what you have learned, but never forget that with great power comes great responsibility. The art of breaking human will is complete only when it includes the wisdom to heal what has been broken and build what has been torn down.